Between 1921 and 1929, the image conveyed by the United States was of a population living in the best possible society despite the prohibition and the rise of gangsterism. The industrial growth of the main economic power had never been so strong before, unashamed even. What a contrast with the previous decade marked by the Great War. The political and financial authorities drummed out the same message about confidence, durable prosperity, and well-being. Toward the end of the decade, the economic boom turned to general euphoria. The Roaring '20s were also the days of the first Miss America elections, the first Oscar ceremonies, the first musicals, all set to a jazz background.
To call the 1920s, the period before the Depression, to call that the age of jazz, the age of prosperity, the Roaring '20s, was to distort the picture.
So it was not a, you might say, a boom in which everybody was enjoying prosperity. It was people at the top were, but most Americans were not doing well at all.
We hit a new stage of affluence. Suddenly, most American families owned an automobile. Only 10 years before, they didn't. They owned electric washing machines, electric refrigerators, electric record players. The talkies, sound movies, started in 1927. So it looked like a new age. I think people were warning it couldn't last. But for the most part, America believed maybe there would be a little pullback, a slowdown, but we were in a new time, a new economy.
The 1920s marks the beginning of the automobile moving to the center of American culture, and it meant that even working class people were eager to buy a car.
Ça, c'est quelque chose d'impensable en Europe. En Europe, jamais un simple salarié n'avait une voiture dans les années 30. Il n'y avait que les patrons, des gens très très riches, etc. Donc les États-Unis ont accès à une certaine frange de la consommation de masse, et ils ont effectivement commencé à développer le crédit.
Credit becomes something that people can rely on. Credit for consumer purchasers like buying a Model T Ford or buying a car comes in as a phenomenon.
In 1919, there were 6 million automobiles in the U.S. 10 years later, 27 million, one for every 5 Americans.
Consumer culture blossoms in America. Installment credit buying blossoms in America. It's the age of the flapper, of bootleg gin, of jazz. It's also a period of enormous excitement about the stock market, where all kinds of ordinary people, not just the stock market professionals who'd always participated in Wall Street, but ordinary folk began to see Wall Street as a place to play, to grow rich quickly, a place that was largely risk-free. Therefore, the 20s in America is a period in which Wall Street, for the first time in its history, is associated with play culture, with getting drunk, with sexual abandon, with consumer delights. Wall Street becomes a part of that larger way of life.
America discovered a passion for stock exchange dabbling. In 5 years, stock market prices were multiplied by 4. The Dow Jones Index went from 100 to nearly 400. Such a rise seems incomprehensibly enormous in view of the actual economic situation. Dazzled and fascinated by the promise of easy money on the New York Stock Exchange, or Wall Street as it is known, Americans turned out their pockets. In 1929, $2 billion were invested on the stock market.
More people than ever before were buying stocks. This was really the first time in American history that the stock market sort of moved to the center of the culture.
The prosperity is so great and so widespread and so sustained, going on for many years in a row, that the average citizen who would never otherwise think of starting a business, who would never otherwise think of getting into the stock market, actually considers doing so.
La bourse devenait le sujet de tous les ménages. Tout le monde pensait que c'était un nouvel Eldorado et les ménages investissaient leurs économies dans la bourse comme un casino.
People, particularly Americans, have always been trying to get rich fast. The difference is that in the 1920s, it seemed like there were more ways than ever before to try to do that, and the stock market was one of those ways. It was a new kind of wealth to people. You'd go in and you'd buy a stock, let's say at 20, and you didn't know anything about the stock market. And the next day the stock is 23, and the next day it's 27, and you haven't lifted a finger. And boy, that was easy. If I just keep doing this, I'll make a lot of money and I won't have to do anything. And it got to the point where people became addicted to the market.
The stock exchanges in Europe were aristocratic, that only a few people engaged in the stock exchange, whereas the stock exchanges in the United States were democratic.
And they're ordinary people. They're salaried workers, they're middle-class folks, they're shoeshine boys, they're housewives, they're ordinary folk like you and me. This is an extraordinary new phenomenon, and they are giddy about it.
C'est une époque où les chauffeurs de maître conduisaient en ayant la tête légèrement penchée en arrière pour écouter leur patron discuter des nouvelles imminentes d'un rachat de telle entreprise par telle autre. Donc il y a une vraie euphorie collective.
People would feel foolish not participating in the money that was almost there to pick off the ground. There was this kind of collective herding mentality.
John Jacob Raskob, head of General Motors, assures everybody that the economy is safe, sound, and guaranteed to be prosperous. In fact, he writes a very famous article that appears in the Ladies' Home Journal. Everybody ought to be rich, he says in this article, and he tells them how. And this appears 1 year before the great crash of 1929.
John Raskob wrote, if a person saved $15 a month and invested it in good common stocks, within 1 or 2 years, given the rapid growth of stock prices, he would have $80,000. The financial press hailed him as a visionary. It was like the gold rush on Wall Street.
Millions of people wanted to be in on the action, wanted to buy stock, and there were, all over the country, there were offices with ticker tape bringing the results from Wall Street.
There are ticker tapes in beauty parlors. There are ticker tapes on railroad trains. There are ticker tapes in bar rooms. There are ticker tapes on ocean liners. So that for the first time, speculating in the market becomes a kind of part of everyday life. It had never been that before. So you have brokerages springing up in small towns, in villages, in small cities all across America, toggled together by electronic wire to the headquarters on Wall Street, encouraging people to participate in the street. It becomes a kind of sport that people are all playing together.
It wasn't the lower class that was buying stock, it was the middle class. Because one of the things that happens in the 1920s as part of this whole pattern of the new consumer culture is banks are more willing to loan, to make relatively small loans to individuals on no real collateral. That had never been done before.
One American in 3 entrusted his savings to the magicians on Wall Street, especially as it wasn't even necessary to have the available capital. The stockbrokers gave credit, and the banks loaned cash and made their capital work. The brokers pocketed tidy commissions, and everybody made a fortune. People bought today to sell the next day. Investment companies multiplied and prospered. A new firm was set up every day.
People speculate by borrowing the money on margin. That is, they put up a very small percentage of their own money to purchase a stock, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, maybe even less than 10%. And credit is so available, and everybody is so super confident, overconfident that these speculations will pay off in the end, that people are taking enormous credit risks in investing in the market.
As long as the price of the stock went up, your collateral in the loan was always covered, and it looked like the easiest thing in the world, and you get twice the bang for your buck. But once it starts to fall, the stock price starts to fall, then you have to put in more cash to cover the what's called the margin, the difference between the amount you borrowed and what the stock is now worth.
Prosperity is just around the corner.
The new president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, based his whole campaign on one slogan: prosperity is just around the corner. They even turned it into a song. Like him, the best economists considered that the rise in the stock market was perfectly justified by the general stability of prices, the prosperity, and the favorable perspectives of the U.S. economy.
He had a golden opportunity in his inaugurals to say, stock is too high, we need to do something about the market. But as a politician, if he does that, and the market then goes down, as it probably would and should, everybody would blame him for causing the crash. So he didn't do that.
The election has again confirmed the determination of the American people, and opportunity must be given for the expression of popular will, and we should keep it so.
When Hoover said that, the market took off again. During the summer of 1929, June, July, and August, when normally the market's slow because it's summer, people are on vacation and so forth, the market went crazy.
Political and financial leaders celebrated this euphoria and this reckless speculation. This is everybody from President Herbert Hoover and includes the nation's chief bankers. And the country is so overcome by this sense of confidence. And they're being encouraged in this confidence by apparently the most prudent, savvy people in the country. The country's financial elite is saying everything's fine.
There was no reason to think that anything else would happen. People really imagined that this would go on, and even the most famous economists.
It drove stock prices up to irrational, even silly levels. Despite those crazy levels, as in all speculative booms, there were people who said, the stock market is right. Those high levels are deserved.
There's a Nobel Prize winner named Edward Prescott in the U.S. who argues that stock market was not especially high in 1929.
The best experts, the risk experts, saying, don't worry, it will never happen. And besides, you can diversify, and if it goes down in one place, it'll only be in one place, other places it won't. That's absurd.
In 1929, you had a stock market that had been going up, up, up. And as it kept going up, it sort of cut loose from its moorings, by which I mean instead of being based on real values of the underlying companies, it was a speculator's market in which people bought and sold stock thinking that if they bought it now, they could sell it later for more money.
Investment pools were conspiracies, really, of insiders. Top investment bankers, sometimes politicians, who wanted to speculate in a particular stock. And so they would buy up huge amounts of that stock, send its price, therefore, skyrocketing, then quickly and secretly dump the stock so that they could realize the profits, while all those ordinary folk who had been encouraged to buy that same stock because they were watching its escalation were left with the losings.
Ce processus-là, il y a un moment où il se déconnecte de l'économie réelle. Et évidemment, on pourrait dire, attention, c'est déconnecté, ça va péter. Oui, mais c'est de l'intérêt de personne de dire ça. C'est-à-dire que les gens continuent, et les plus rationnels ici sont ceux qui se disent, je vais profiter de la montée des cours jusqu'à ce que ça s'inverse le plus tard possible, en quelque sorte.
You can make more and more by taking bigger and bigger risks. Taking bigger and bigger risks led to higher and higher prices for stocks and willingness to borrow excessively in order to do that. And that created a structure that, once it cracked, came apart completely.
Suppose stock prices quadruple and go from 100 to 400, even over the course of a decade. A lot of people would look at that and say, that is crazy. You would not trust a stock market that had prices going up like that.
There were people who saw that the economy's growth was based on false premises and warned that a problem would arise.
There are a handful of Wall Street bankers, investment bankers, who say that the economy and the market itself is way overextended, that speculation on margin is dangerous, that the stock market, the values on the stock market are grossly inflated, warning that that there are danger signs. There are some people like the statistician Roger Babson, and they are systematically ignored.
Roger Babson declared in September, 1 month before the collapse, sooner or later a crash is coming. It'll be terrific, colossal even. The stock market will fall by its own weight, and there'll be a mad rush beyond anything we've ever seen.
The higher the market got, the more other people shouted down those who warned that the market was getting out of control. Because if people started taking them seriously, they'd start to sell their stock and the stock market would go down.
There were signs before the market crashed that the economy was starting to go down again. Short-term signs of economic recession can never be trusted. We always have pauses and sometimes economies come back, but there were signs of over-speculation all over the place, in particular the high level of stock prices, which were very hard to justify on any historical basis. But there was there were investment trusts that average people were putting their money in. Investment trusts were able to borrow a lot of money to invest in stocks. Average people, typical people, were borrowing money on their own to buy individual stocks, margin borrowing. So there were all kinds of signs that there was trouble to come.
It began to sort of vacillate through September. And then in October, it began to fall. And then in about the third week in October, the bottom started to fall out.
And that's usually a sign when the bubble will burst. And it did in October of 1929.
The crash of 1929 was like a perfect storm in which all of these improbable things came together at the wrong time in the wrong way.
And on Thursday, October 24th, Black Thursday, collective insanity put in an appearance. In just a few hours, 13 million stocks were suddenly dumped on the market by panic-stricken shareholders who didn't even know at what price they'd sold their shares. After 3 years of intense speculation, Wall Street crashed. And no one was in a position to decide to close the stock market. The president of Wall Street was on vacation in Hawaii. The speculative bubble burst, causing financial panic. Through a domino effect, the whole of the stock market collapsed. The cumulative losses amounted to $30 billion, 10 times the U.S. Federal Reserve budget, and more than the United States had spent during the whole of World War I. In 6 days, average prices went down 50% and kept falling. And what was even more unusual, the stock market crash carried on.
Oh, the crash was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. It was inevitable. And then people realized that they had been assuming that prices would never fall, and that assumption was wrong. So their whole life had been based on an assumption that prices could go only one way. Of course, if they had read history, they would know that that was a stupid idea. They know that prices come up and prices come down.
People had been putting their hand in the till at work, taking the money, putting it in the market, figuring that it's going to go up, so it'll go up, I'll cash in, put the money back in the till, and no one will be the wiser. But when the market crashed, there was no way to get the money back out.
All of a sudden, they realized the model that had been in their mind was totally wrong. And realizing that they were wrong, they panic. But as they panic, what do they see? Their neighbor panic.
On the market itself, of course, the brokers are going crazy. They're tearing their hair out. They can't keep up with the descent of the market. Many people lose their money because the trades they tried to make couldn't be made in time at the prices they were trying to make them because the market was so over. The capacity to handle those trades wasn't there anymore. The wires are burning up.
The ticker tape, which recorded all the sales, couldn't keep up, and it would fall several hours behind. And when it fell that far behind, that means that if you were at 2 o'clock and you only knew what the market was doing at 10:30, you were in big trouble because you didn't know what had happened.
And as it was going down, those who were slower said, oh, I made a mistake. I wish I'd been faster. And the process accelerates, and you get this sense of free fall.
What precipitates that? I don't think to this day anybody really knows what precipitates Black Tuesday or Black Thursday, why that particular day.
Cette vieille histoire-là, tout le monde savait que ça allait arriver, mais personne n'a prévu l'ampleur que ça allait prendre.
There was something fundamentally wrong with this economy, not only with the market, with the stock market, not only that stocks were grossly overvalued, but there were underlying problems with the economy, that this illusion of prosperity that had so captivated people for nearly a decade was indeed an illusion, and that the panic was a kind of inarticulate emotional recognition of that fact, because, in other words, it was grounded in something real. It wasn't pure hysteria.
Inside, it's like a rail station at the start of the vacation, the Wall Street Journal wrote. A Niagara of liquidation. Men and women jostled each other to try to understand what was going on. These figures and letters were incomprehensible to a layman, but they spelled ruin. On the floor, there were thousands of discarded stock exchange orders, like empty cartridges on a battlefield, wrote the New York Times.
The Great Crash is supposed to have produced mass suicides on Wall Street and elsewhere. It became the object of a kind of gallows humor. There were cartoons about Wall Street bankers jumping out of windows and so on. It's a grossly exaggerated legend.
The wildest rumors were going around. 11 speculators were said to have committed suicide. It is alleged that the manager of the Ritz required customers to pay for their room in advance, asking them if they wanted a room to spend the night or to jump.
There were indeed some suicides, not very many. One of the most notable, however, was witnessed by Winston Churchill. Churchill was visiting New York at the time of the crash. He first visited the stock market and was struck by not the panic on the market floor, but by a kind of dazed somnambulism of brokers walking around almost as if they were in a kind of semi-comatose state. And then he went back to his hotel, and while he was in his hotel, someone indeed did jump out the window of the hotel he was staying with, who turned out to be a Wall Street broker who had been ruined.
C'est l'archétype des histoires qu'on raconte quand un mythe se propage. Le premier soir où les cours vraiment se sont effondrés, les opérateurs sont sortis dans la rue. Une sorte d'angoisse collective, évidemment. Et puis alors, ils ont levé la tête, là, à Wall Street, et puis au sommet d'un des buildings, ils ont vu un type qui était en l'air. Et la foule s'est dit, il va sauter. Ce type, c'était un plombier. Il était en train de remettre une gouttière. Évidemment, il n'est pas tombé. Mais la foule attendait ça. Tout le monde a un petit peu envie de voir des spéculateurs se suicider. On en a envie, s'en sont mis plein les poches. On peut quand même rêver qu'il y ait quelques suicides bien spectaculaires.
On Black Thursday, Herbert Hoover refused to go to Wall Street, choosing to take tea with Marie Curie, who was visiting the White House. He reminded her that he had been Secretary of Commerce before being elected president, and that America was sure of herself and would enjoy endless prosperity. At the same moment, outside the deserted stock exchange, ruined businessmen tried to sell their luxury automobiles for next to nothing.
The reaction, the official reaction to the crash of the market is a sense of shock, disbelief, and hubris, a sense that if they act and simply assure people that everything is all right, the market will immediately recover. John D. Rockefeller goes and buys some stock in a very public way to show that he too is confident that the economy is sound and the market is sound.
John Rockefeller, the richest man in the world, saw his fortune melt by 80%.
In the 93 years of my life, depressions have come and gone. Prosperity has always returned and will again.
It tries to assure everybody that the market is sound, that this is a temporary lull, and this act of buying up stock is a display of confidence in the market. And it doesn't work. Herbert Hoover, the president of the country, issues pronouncements that the underlying structure of the economy is sound, that people need not fear or panic. But everybody does indeed panic. And the panic is irreversible. It's extraordinary. It even has a sound to it. 10,000 people gather outside the New York Stock Exchange. The city is very afraid. They order mounted police. They think there's going to be a storming of the Bastille that is a storming of the New York Stock Exchange. And that crowd gathers there and stays there for weeks and is a kind of low hum that kind of is emitted from the crowd, a kind of dull roar, a kind of, it's like the sound of panic, the sound of anxiety.
Crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
Herbert Hoover very, very quickly, once the crash hits, loses credibility in the eyes of the American people. He's doing nothing. He's making constant false assurances that always turn out to be untrue.
Did not recognize the crisis when it occurred. He tried to say it's not so bad, you know, we will recover quickly.
His statements about prosperity being around the corner were an attempt to give confidence to the market. No president is going to say we're about to have a disaster. But because they were false promises, when the reality showed them to be inconsistent with what they had said, it actually discredited Hoover.
The Congress and the president together could have appeared on the Capitol steps easily and said, we realize that what we're doing is destructive, but they didn't. And the president did not look back on the crash, apologize for having caused it, and express any regret for its policies. It's continued its policies as it had before.
He himself, I think, is so stunned by what has happened, so confident that the market will recover.
The Federal Reserve was saying that the stock market crash was no great deal, no great concern, nothing to worry about, and that it was not presaging any kind of economic downturn. Well, of course, that was a dead wrong assumption.
The crash was not the event of one day. It really spread out across a week, and it's sort of, the fall went on for almost 3 weeks, from late October into middle November. After that, the market began to recover, and it actually gained back during the winter something like a third of what it had lost. And it looked like recovery was on the way. Everybody was looking not at the market, but at the economy, what was going to happen.
On a du mal à croire qu'un événement déclencheur comme la baisse de la bourse, qui perd tout de même presque 50% de sa valeur en quelques mois, ça ait déclenché une telle apocalypse.
The crash on a particular day in 1929 was something like 24-25%. But actually, from 1929 to the bottom of the stock market, the entire decline was 80%.
In fact, Wall Street had already started its long, interminable descent into hell, and the whole of America's economic activity followed this downward slope until it reached the depths of the abyss.
It really snowballs after 1929. More and more banks fail. If you have money in a bank and the bank fails, you've lost it all. So that means there's a run on the bank, and there is literally a financial crisis.
American opinion was shocked by the collapse of what was once the indestructible bastion of triumphant capitalism, the banks.
People are desperate, and the banking system is collapsed. There's an enormous liquidity crunch. There's no credit available to restart the engines of the economy.
One of the controversies, 29, was what role did the central bank play? Would it have been able to reverse it if allowed, provided more money to the banking system?
The complete evaporation of confidence in the economy, and in the financial sector particularly, means there's no credit available.
So it was a period of following decline in economic activity that finally led to a financial crisis that then, of course, continued the downward spiral of the economy.
Suddenly, a banking community will not be able to lend money. People will not be able to buy houses. That feeds on itself, and that's how recessions work. Businesses start to lay off workers. They can't get loans to meet their payroll. They can't get loans to keep their businesses going. Businesses go out of business. More people are let go. Other people are afraid they will be let go. They stop spending. You spend less money. Business makes even less profit. More businesses go under. And all of this feeds on itself, and the economy sinks into this sort of death spiral, or at least coma spiral, let's call it. But that takes time. Markets can collapse in a few days, but the economy sinking takes time.
When the economy collapsed, there was no reservoir of consumer purchasing power to buoy it up again.
And people began to lose jobs. Then you get this shift. And once that mood shift starts, it's very, very hard to reverse again.
And so you get this escalating crisis that begins as a banking crisis, but becomes a general economic crisis.
L'enchaînement qui se met en place, c'est inquiet par l'effondrement de la bourse, les ménages suspendent un certain nombre d'achats de biens durables, et notamment d'automobiles, qui chutent brutalement en 1930. Les gens tout d'un coup perdent confiance, alors la consommation, l'investissement, les stocks s'effondrent. Les gens arrêtent pendant un an purement et simplement d'acheter des automobiles. À ce moment-là, ce secteur doit licencier, et les ouvriers de l'automobile qui sont licenciés, à leur tour cessent de consommer. En cessant de consommer, ils propagent la crise à d'autres secteurs qui à leur tour licencient, et en licenciant, on a un effondrement de la demande solvable. Plus personne n'est plus en mesure de consommer quoi que ce soit.
People stop buying things. They start worrying about the future, whereas before the future looked like nothing but bright because the market was going up. They had money. But as soon as the market crashes and the underlying causes start to seep in, like the housing market.
Dans les années 29, l'immobilier va jouer un rôle très important. Dans certaines villes, c'est 60% des ménages américains qui vont faire défaut sur leur emprunt. Quiconque est endetté au cours de cette époque ne peut plus payer, même s'il travaille. Tout d'un coup, les gens ne sont plus capables de supporter le poids de leurs dettes, font faillite, et du coup doivent à la fois arrêter de consommer et en même temps mettre en péril les établissements financiers qui sont intermédiaires, qui portent leurs dettes auprès des créanciers.
And once the house prices stopped growing, the whole house of cards collapsed.
Les ménages ont perdu sur deux fronts. Ils ont perdu parce que la valeur de l'immobilier s'est effondrée, et puis parce que la bourse s'est effondrée. Donc cette chute générale des prix va se conjuguer à la chute générale de l'activité pour rendre difficile, pour mettre en insolvabilité tous les emprunteurs.
As business failed, they couldn't repay the loans. The only way they could do it by borrowing more and more. But that process had to come to an end.
Et pour les ménages américains, ça signifie que tout d'un coup, ils se sont retrouvés pauvres. Mais c'est un choc psychologique absolument considérable. Les ménages américains qui pensaient qu'ils pouvaient se dispenser d'épargner pour préparer leurs vieux jours, parce que la bourse silencieusement leur préparait leur retraite, cette idée s'est effondrée.
They thought that they had made their life, and then suddenly the floor dropped out from under them, and they started to lose it all again. I mean, who's hurt by a depression? The poor have always been poor. You know, this is not anything particularly new to them. It's a little harder. The rich, if you've got $20 million and you lose 10 or 12 million, you can still scrape by on that other 8 million. It's the middle class, the ones who are new to that lifestyle. And the middle class on that level, as I said, because of the consumer economy, was grounded in the possession of material things, whether it's an automobile, whether it's clothes, whether it's your house or whatever. And all of that is one by one taken away from them.
And so the economy continues to descend and descend and descend, no matter what Hoover is prepared to do, and he's prepared to do not very much.
The kinds of views that Hoover advocated were the kinds of policies that made the Great Depression as bad as it was. He refused to really have the kind of stimulus that the country needed. There was really a lack of comprehension of the depth of the problems and the appropriate policies to respond to it.
The results of the World War and its aftermath.
To boost the confidence of the financial world, Hoover decided to urgently repatriate to the U.S. capital loaned to Germany. This was a devastating measure and a monumental mistake. Germany, which was barely recovering from the war, was hit hard by the withdrawal of American capital.
The effect was simply to cut the flows of money that had previously, in the middle of the 1920s, moved from the United States to Europe and had fed an economic boom.
World War I was not forgotten in 1929. There was still a lot of anger, and the Depression gave the Hoover administration and the Republicans at the time the opportunity to vent their anger, among other things. There is no way it would have saved the day by repatriating that money.
Les propriétaires américains ont rapatrié leurs capitaux, ce qui a asséché des banques, qui a asséché l'économie allemande, etc. Et donc il y a eu un jeu avec les capitaux américains très déstabilisateur. Donc autrement dit, c'est une strangulation progressive qui était programmée.
I don't think they were fully aware of the implications of what they were doing.
L'histoire du monde a basculé à ce moment-là. C'est pas parce qu'aux États-Unis, on a connu pendant 2 ou 3 ans un taux de chômage à 25%. C'est pas ça. Ce qui fait qu'on reste traumatisé par la crise de 29, c'est parce qu'elle a traversé l'Atlantique et que le premier pays européen qui est touché par la crise, c'est l'Allemagne. Et la raison pour laquelle l'Allemagne est la première touchée, c'est que la reconstruction allemande n'a pu être faite en Allemagne que par le financement de capitaux américains qui se sont immédiatement retirés au premier moment de la crise de 1929, retirant le tapis sous les pieds de l'Allemagne.
The very first credit transfer spelled disaster for the German economy. The amount of the U.S. loans was staggering. The Reichsbank had to send 14 billion marks to the U.S. in gold and currency. Investors were ruined, the emptied banks were mobbed.
The international financial system, the way it worked, clearly contributed to the spread of the crisis in Germany, and that led to contraction of the economy. So that was one of the factors that contributed to the downward spiral.
What had been a local affair, that is a largely American affair, becomes a European-wide depression in a continent which itself has been suffering almost for the whole decade from a very weak economy. Not like the United States. Europe hadn't been booming during the 20s, but in fact was suffering all the consequences of a devastating World War I, only was beginning to rebuild its industry and its agricultural economy and so on.
Germany had been in an economic mess all through the 1920s. Remember the horrendous mega inflation of the 1920s just about wiped out the German middle class in the 1920s. And a lot of that was the spillover from the horrible terms of the Versailles Treaty.
Those debts, war reparation debts and war loan debts, hang over the economy, depressing it further until finally the depression spreads from the United States to Europe.
Les capitaux américains, l'Allemagne en avait besoin, parce que pour financer justement les réparations dont une partie ont été payées, eh bien l'Allemagne s'est endettée.
And when you look at the German deal, that what Germany got vis-a-vis France, and what France did to Germany in that period, and what the UK along with France did, and what the US allowed to happen to Germany, we hurt Germany in a way that damaged stable democracy, of course.
Et la France a tout fait pour favoriser l'extrême droite. On est parti de l'idée, puisque l'économie allemande va mal, c'est que c'est bénéficiaire pour la France. Et ça, c'était faux.
Il y a eu en fait un processus dans lequel, à mon avis, les Français se sont révélés aveuglés par leur désir de revanche et fait l'erreur colossale. Évidemment, la crise est arrivée là-dessus. La crise n'a rien arrangé.
C'est une république qui recommence à exister, à respirer. Et c'est 1929 qui a cassé cette dynamique, qui a immédiatement, sur un corps fragilisé par les crises antérieures, rouvert la plaie. Alors pour moi, il n'y a pas de doute possible que c'est la crise de 1929 qui a provoqué cette montée aux extrêmes, et la crise est venue frapper un corps malade, fatigué, qui n'a trouvé d'issue que dans le nazisme.
In Germany, industrial production collapsed, bankruptcies increased, and the number of unemployed reached over 6 million, leading to widespread disillusionment and anger. Hunger marches were held in several cities, and soup kitchens sprang up once again.
Nous habitions dans la Mendelssohnstraße et je me souviens de ma grand-mère distribuant une sorte de soupe à l'entrée et je demandais qu'est-ce que c'est que ça, c'est pour les chômeurs. C'est la première fois que j'ai entendu le mot chômeur.
Il y a un parallélisme tout à fait étonnant entre l'Allemagne et les États-Unis tout au long de cette période. Dans les deux cas, le taux de chômage va monter à 25% et on va voir exactement le même effondrement à la fois des prix et de la production qu'aux États-Unis. Les pays européens vont absorber la crise d'une manière qui va être plus ou moins tragique, mais qui ne sera jamais aussi spectaculaire que ce qu'on observera aussi bien en Allemagne qu'aux États-Unis.
In the United States, the shockwave of the stock exchange collapse had not subsided before the effects of the terrible, irreversible spiral of recession began to be felt. American industrial production dropped by half. Thousands of families had to rely on the soup kitchen for food.
The economy did not recover, and by June, because spring was usually the big month for when the economy begins to perk up for the coming season, didn't happen. And as a result, the bottom just sort of fell out of the market again, and the country drifted along until about October. And it's not until really about October of 30 that the country begins to fall into a depression.
America's sturdiest strongholds collapsed after the Wall Street crash. It was in stark contrast to the recent period of rapid growth. 1 worker in 5 was unemployed. The population seemed anesthetized. In New York, where every month 17,000 families were put on the streets, hundreds of thousands of unemployed, including many white-collar workers, struggled to survive, trudging through the cold for hours just to get a bowl of soup and a piece of bread.
The government has no safety programs, no safety net welfare programs. There is no unemployment insurance. So as people lose jobs and they're thrown on the streets, they have nowhere to go but to private charities. And those private charities are just completely overwhelmed.
My early memories of the Depression was seeing my mother standing on one of these lines to get food, ashamed of being poor, ashamed of having to ask somebody for something. I remember that, very vividly, because it was very painful to see her on this line waiting to get some food. As the Depression got worse, we moved from bad tenements to worse tenements. Of course, another thing I remember is my own family. My father was a waiter When the Depression came, there was less work, and so my father had to do many other things. Desperately, he became a salesman of ties, of neckties, because I remember I felt very ashamed. Walking past down the street to school, and there was my father selling ties on the street, and to this day I'm ashamed of my own reaction. And another time he became a window cleaner, and he did that until he fell from one of his window cleaning jobs and hurt himself. And I remember my father doing some cleaning streets or something like that.
And that's part of the awful tragedy of the Depression. It's literally etched on the faces of people. Men get up and they go out to look for work, and they know they're not going to find anything. And so they're going to spend half the day sitting on a park bench feeling useless.
It was a reality that it was very difficult to escape from. I think you couldn't go anywhere without seeing the signs of depression. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing the boarded up stores, the factories that were not working, the people standing on the street. In the early phases of the Depression, many men, for instance, still dressed up as if they were going to work because they didn't want to tell their families. They were too embarrassed to tell their families that they were unemployed, but then they would stand around in their work clothing all day in the street to be away from home, to be somewhere else.
Broken by the recession and prepared to do anything to survive, more and more people took part in numerous dance marathons, a 1930s variant of ancient circus games. The rule of these trials was simple. Couples had to dance for as long as possible, sometimes for several days, in the hope of winning the $500 awarded to the last couple standing, to the delight of the audiences who came to forget their own misery. The organizers thought of everything: doctors, beds, and food. The losers at least got the chance to eat.
That's one of the things that I remember. Of course, another thing I remember is people being evicted from their tenements. Even as low as the rents were, they could not afford to pay them. And so the police would come, they'd take their furniture and put them out on the street. And I remember as a little boy going by these scenes of furniture out on the streets, and you might see the mother crying, weeping, because it was not only that they had lost their home, but it was psychologically humiliating for them to have all of their possessions in full view of everybody, and for everybody to know that they could not pay their rent. But once or twice I saw scenes of rebellion, people organizing to move the furniture back, to defy the police, and this happened several times.
People, as they lost their homes, had to go somewhere, and they went largely into these makeshift huts that they put together with cardboard and tin and leftover materials. They slept in caves in Central Park.
There are tent cities all over America of homeless people that are called Hoovervilles in mocking disdain for what Hoover has visited upon the country.
Central Park in New York City had a number of Hoovervilles, and Hoovervilles were for a number of years, the shame of our society.
Once I lived the life of a millionaire, spending my money, Lord, I didn't care. I carried my friends out for a mighty good time, buying bootleg liquor, champagne and wine. Then I begun to fall so low. Didn't have no money and no place to go. If I get my hands on a dollar again, I'm gonna hold on to it till the eagle grins, because nobody knows you when you're down and out. In your pockets, not one penny, and your friends, you have not any. But when you get on your feet again, everybody wants to be your long-lost friend. It's mighty strange, without a doubt.
If you're passionate about documentaries, go online to view more programs, read articles and join the discussion at sbs.com.au/documentary.
In a little less than a year, the financial crisis reached a new level and spread to the whole country. In the countryside, the situation was alarming, worse than that of the cities. Wheat went down 50% in value. The spectacular fall in farm prices hit farmers hard, and their produce became unsellable. There were millions of tons of food, but no one could afford to buy. Farmers could no longer pay their debts, were thrown off their land, and took to the roads.
The plight everybody identifies with, the plight of homelessness, of poverty, of no work, of family disintegration, becomes a universal plight.
People were looking for new places to work, and so there was this sense of moving around and also moving out of the agricultural states, which were particularly badly affected.
There are mass migrations out of the Middle West of evicted farmers looking desperately for work someplace, migrant labor of some kind or another.
And many of them lost their farms at this time, and this was in the early 1930s. And farm evictions were a terrible stain upon society. Many farmers were evicted because they rented their land or they owned their land and they couldn't keep up the payments.
Farmers out in the Midwest are forcibly stopping auctions from happening by evicted farmers. When the judge shows up to auction off the farm, the farmers' neighbors gather and pay a penny for that farm. Don't let anybody else bid and return the farm to the evicted farmer.
What are you going to get for 5 cents? Who gets 10 for it? 6 cents. 6 cents bid. Who gets 10? I'll be 65 to 10. Say 10 for it. You get 10 for it. Take it out. We can't use that stuff. We've got to go back to the music. I got a dime for 15. 15 I got. 20. Yeah. Sold her. Outside with her. Yeah. We'll knock them in the head. They're not worth anything.
In rural areas, you have no place to go. And what you have here, what the real tragedy is, that's kind of stupid irony that you have farmers destroying their crops because they literally can't afford to take them to market for the prices they're getting. And people are going without food. You have people cold and without clothing when the warehouses are bulging with clothing. You have homes and apartments standing empty while people are having to sleep in the streets and on the subway and in the subways and so forth. It's that irony that really was grating about the Depression.
And here was an economic system that blew up between 1929 and 1932. And when you've got an explosion of this kind, it's very difficult to just stick the bits together again and carry on as if nothing happened.
The steel industry is operating by 1931 at 10% of its capacity. Unemployment will soon approach 25% of the workforce.
There was a kind of agitation in the country. There was turmoil. There were strikes going on, and there were picket lines and demonstrations. The Communist Party was leading a struggle for the rights of workers. There was something about the poverty, the conditions of that time, which made many people feel that, oh, yes, this is the only organization that is doing something about the Depression.
All the social insurgencies of the 1930s, whether they are anti-monopoly movements or farmer labor independent political parties, have a heavy quotient of progressive and radical militants. The labor movement in the 1930s is inconceivable without the vital role played by militant cadre from the Communist Party and the Socialist Party.
Alors à partir de là, un cycle s'enclenche, c'est un cycle de répression. Et en fait, la violence va apparaître, il va y avoir des manifestations, il va y avoir des morts, il va y avoir tout ça. Mais il n'y a pas du tout de vraie révolte. Et il va donner lieu à des images chocs, à des révoltes sporadiques. À Dearborn, là où Ford a licencié les 3/4 de ses salariés, il y a eu des émeutes où là aussi, la police tire sur les manifestants.
In Ford factories, where the number of workers had dropped from 130,000 to 37,000, those who were lucky enough to keep their jobs saw their monthly salary fall from $50 to $16. And when they went on strike, the police opened fire on them. 5 were killed and dozens wounded.
Herbert Hoover does certain things which are so offensive, and perhaps the most offensive thing he does is to send troops to break up what is called the Bonus Army, which is gathered in Washington, and these are veterans of World War I, to demand an early payment of the bonuses that were promised them when they returned from the European War in 1918.
14,000 came from all over the country. They rode the rails, mounted trains they couldn't afford. Every way they could, they came to Washington, D.C.
They presented a petition to Congress, and Congress rejected it. They sort of set up camp on the Mall, which became the sort of Hooverville of the bonus expeditionary force. Some of the people who had come went home. Some really didn't have any reason to go home, so they just stayed on. And they were no threat to anybody.
Hoover allowed himself to be led astray by two soldiers, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, future U.S. President, and above all, General Douglas MacArthur.
Douglas MacArthur, you have to understand, was the kind of person who, once he got an idea in his head, it never occurred to him that it could be wrong. And he got the idea in his head that these people represented a grave threat to the Republic, that they might somehow storm Congress or do something. I mean, these were families. It's not that they're not just an army, they're not armed or anything. And he began to put this to Hoover. And finally, MacArthur persuaded him that this was indeed a threat.
And Hoover sent out the military to shoot at them. It was disastrous.
Under General MacArthur's command, 4 cavalry platoons, an infantry column equipped with bayonets and gas masks, and 6 tanks attacked and set fire to shacks. Two people were shot dead and a third, a 2-month-old baby, suffocated to death from tear gas. Another child was more fortunate. As he tried to return to his shack to get his teddy bear, a soldier stopped him by stabbing him in the legs with his bayonet.
It was an ugly thing. And what it did, and the reaction of the American people was, Herbert Hoover must have lost his mind. This destroyed the last shred of credibility he had. MacArthur, because he was MacArthur, went to his grave believing he'd save the Republic from, a revolution.
A great irony that the military heroes of World War II, MacArthur, Eisenhower, would attack the veterans of World War I and break up the bonus army.
And this so angers people. It's such a brutal, kind of callous indifference to the plight of Americans.
That incident basically killed Hoover's reputation. I mean, his reputation was already in disrepair over the bad economic policies. That was disastrous for Hoover's approval ratings.
Prosperity is just around the corner.
What we'd like to know is which corner. We've turned so many corners now, we're dizzy.
But still, I'm positive we'll soon be busy.
Hoover, again with great reluctance, begins to establish some minimal forms of federal relief. But all of Hoover's actions don't measure up to the dimensions of the crisis. They don't come close to measuring up to the severity of the crisis.
The governor of New York, remember, was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Roosevelt did try to institute some sort of welfare programs to alleviate the suffering because it was so obvious in big cities like New York.
Roosevelt himself, of course, was rich, an aristocrat, and he was not really attuned to the lives of the poor. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she actually went into poor districts and she saw how people lived. She had seen with her own eyes the conditions of the poor, how much poverty there was and how much distress there was made known to Roosevelt, not directly, but from his wife.
Everybody expected Eleanor Roosevelt to show up because she was his eyes and ears, and she went all sorts of places. Roosevelt depended upon her because he couldn't get to a lot of places.
Roosevelt, who was struck by polio in 1921, faced a problem with no historical precedent. He was disabled, and yet he stood at the next presidential election against Hoover. He had promised he would to millions of underprivileged who were awaiting upon him like the Messiah.
There's a poem called Waiting on Roosevelt. We're waiting for Roosevelt to do something for us. We're waiting and waiting. And so the poem ends with something like, where are you, Mr. Roosevelt's
On July 2nd, 1932, the Democrat Party convention chose Franklin D. Roosevelt as candidate for the presidential election. He pronounced for the first time the words, New Deal.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
In this dramatic context, the elections in November 1932 had symbolic significance. Roosevelt promised to curb the devastating effects of the 1929 crash with measures such as the reform of the banking system, the assurance of a healthy currency, and economic and social aid. But what convinced the voters was, to his despair, his rather hasty promise to repeal the amendment which prohibited the consumption of alcohol, in other words, the end of the prohibition. Franklin D. Roosevelt won with 23 million votes, compared to Hoover, who only obtained 16 million. This landslide victory put the Democrats in power for the next 20 years.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States. Let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
In November 1932, the United States had just elected Roosevelt. Meanwhile, Germany was at crossroads in its destiny. The economic crisis threw many worried, desperate Germans into Hitler's arms. The capital repatriated to the U.S. brought him instant success. They're not going to put a painter in Bismarck's chair, Roosevelt commented.
J'ai encore souvenir très précis d'un certain nombre de champs hitlériens et des drapeaux à croix gammée vraiment partout. Tout d'un coup, on se retrouve devant les hitlériens qui siègent d'ailleurs au Reichstag en uniforme, qui dans la rue commencent à battre les gens et la terreur commence à s'installer dès l'automne 1932.
The anxiety, the fear, the scapegoating that naturally accompanies this kind of economic desperation had been abroad in the land in Germany for many years, now becomes even more popular, and then looking for scapegoats for the collapse. Communists, Jews.
Mon père est donc directeur d'une clinique pédiatrique, professeur à l'université, franc-maçon, électeur, père de famille et juif. Et Hitler l'a réduit à l'état de juif. Il a été chassé de l'université et j'ai été battu en classe comme petit juif. Cela dans la cour de l'école, ça n'a pas laissé de traces, mais c'était très sensible.
Les Allemands se sont convaincus que seule la pureté de la race pouvait être une solution à leur problème. Dans l'idée d'Hitler, les Juifs étaient le poison à abattre. Il faut un bouc émissaire, il faut tuer l'autre. On peut voir comment une théorie du bouc émissaire, tout simplement, peut se mettre en place. Ce sont les Juifs qui étaient responsables parce qu'ils incarnent le capitalisme mondial et que donc forcément ils étaient aux côtés de l'Amérique. Hitler faisait moins de 2% des voix en 1929. Donc il faudrait une extraordinaire concomitance d'événements pour qu'il passe de 2% à 33% entre 1929 et 1933. On dit souvent que les chômeurs ont amené Hitler au pouvoir, c'est absolument pas vrai. Quand on regarde leur vote, et même celui des ouvriers, c'est plutôt les classes moyennes qui ruinaient, déboussolées, et qui ont voté pour Hitler.
I think there's no question that the economic collapse, the global economic collapse of that period is responsible, heavily responsible for the rise of Hitler. There are similar movements even in a place as politically placid as the United States. The growth of fascist movements against Jews and Wall Street, Semitic Wall Street financiers as the main producers of the Depression, as Shylocks who are looting the American economy. There's a tradition of that, a kind of underground tradition of that in American political life that surfaces in the 30s.
Lots of anti-Semitism. Also leveled at the Roosevelt administration, which had many Jewish people working there. We do not have a perfectly moral history.
There are famous Americans who actually give voice to anti-Semitic sentiments. Henry Ford, who's an American icon, he's an American hero. He's Hitler's hero, too. Hitler actually has a photograph of Henry Ford in his headquarters in Berlin or someplace. And the reason for that is that Ford, during the 1920s, had written a series of articles that became a book, a bestseller, called The International Jew. And it was about how Jewish financiers were conspiring to undermine the American heartland. They were also spreading a kind of promiscuous culture, a kind of decadent culture. They were the purveyors of movies, lascivious movies and sexy novels, and they were behind bootleg liquor and scandals of all kinds. And Ford talks about this kind of international Jewish conspiracy to undermine hardworking, frugal, productive America. And he's enormously popular. Ford could have probably run for president and maybe won in the mid-1920s.
There were movements everywhere. There were very sensible people who had pretty ideas that were no longer sensible.
The crisis accentuated the rise of populism and extremism. All over the place, there were upsurges in anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism. The Ku Klux Klan had 4 million members, mainly in the South. Their constitution said, "Our duty is to maintain forever the supremacy of the white race." They advocated hatred towards foreigners, Jews, and in particular blacks, whom they hunted down after dark to lynch them.
But people forget what a dangerous time it was politically in America and around the world. Democracy was threatened in America by the severe economic circumstances.
The 30s are full of signs of social upheaval on the right that might be characterized as fascist or Nazi-inspired.
This procession of Nazi demonstrators did not take place in Germany, but in Central Park, New York. 20,000 people, including 8,000 uniformed stormtroopers, and thousands of American teenagers who came from youth camps, organized according to the model of the Hitler youth camps, headed towards Madison Square Garden to proclaim the rights of white Christians, true patriots. During the meeting, the crowd booed President Franklin D. Roosevelt and made the Nazi salute, crying out, "Heil Hitler."
They begin to parade in the streets, and they begin to beat up people in the streets, suspect people, Jews, immigrants.
For the first time in a very long time, there was a serious possibility of some kind of dictatorial government, some kind of ideological overthrow of democracy. I think it was probably a real possibility.
On February 15, 1933, 2 weeks after Hitler had risen to power, Roosevelt narrowly escaped an assassination attempt as he was making a speech in Miami. The mayor of Chicago was hit by 2 bullets instead and died, thanking the Lord for sparing Roosevelt. Roosevelt, who didn't attend the funeral, went back to Washington, where he multiplied by 20 the number of his bodyguards and stopped traveling in open-top cars. He knew that he had many enemies, and that he was seen as a Red by the business world, the Supreme Court, and Congress. In the car which drove the 2 presidents, Hoover barely said a word to Roosevelt. He knew that the new president wouldn't spare him in his inaugural speech, and he wouldn't be disappointed. Only a fool can deny the somber reality of the present. Those who governed us failed because they knew nothing but the laws of profit. 500,000 Americans wrote to him before he entered the White House to welcome and encourage him. Roosevelt took office. He made a superhuman effort to give the crowd the impression he was walking, when in fact, he was being carried by his son and a bodyguard.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
By the time he was inaugurated, the financial system was paralyzed. It was almost that way then. The banks were hardly doing anything, and something had to be done to restore confidence in the banks.
The banks were in such disarray that he felt that he could revive the banking system by closing all the banks.
He didn't come on and say dramatically, we're going to close the banks and we'll do something. He came on in a much lighter mood and said, everybody is over anxious about this. We're going to close the banks, and all the banks that are sound will be allowed to reopen.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
When the banks reopened, the financial crisis had passed. It was a brilliant piece of psychology.
Il fixait le prix de toute une série d'éléments de manière totalement autoritaire. Il choisissait la variation du cours du dollar tous les matins au petit déjeuner avec deux conseillers qui disaient bon, écoutez, on laisse monter, on laisse filer, on laisse pas filer.
And one morning, he said to Henry Morgenthau, who would later become his Treasury Secretary, not yet, he said, let it go up 21 cents. And Morgenthau said, why, Mr. President? And Roosevelt says, well, it's because it's 3 times 7, and 3 is a lucky number. And the arbitrary aspect of this displeased markets, of course, as Morgenthau wrote in his diaries, if anyone knew how we set the gold price, they would be frightened.
What Roosevelt has that Hoover lacked is an open mind. He's experimental. He's willing to hear dissident voices, even voices he doesn't agree with, and also a recognition that the crisis is severe and you must try something, and if that something doesn't work, try something else. Don't sit there.
Roosevelt crée les bases d'un monde nouveau. Mais en même temps, la dimension mythologique, c'est qu'il n'y avait pas de plan concerté, c'était un tâtonnement généralisé.
People have nothing to sustain them through these difficult times and no wherewithal to purchase. Franklin Roosevelt recognized that this crisis of underconsumption is killing, potentially fatal.
Pour lutter contre la crise, il faut qu'on embauche des chômeurs à creuser des trous le matin, qu'ils reboucheront le soir. Peu importe l'utilité sociale de cette embauche, ce qui compte, c'est de restaurer la capacité à consommer des agents qui, sinon, peuvent tout simplement dégringoler toute la pente de la crise.
Roosevelt a très bien su se saisir d'une certaine mythologie des États-Unis, et c'est ça son mérite. Ceux qui sont valides, on leur donne une pelle, on leur demande de faire des routes, et le talent de Roosevelt, ça a été de trouver des slogans, mais aussi un choix politique. C'est l'homme de la rue, le common man, qui devient véritablement le noyau de la coalition de Roosevelt, et c'était pas du tout la coalition de Hoover. Hoover était, lui, le représentant du monde des affaires.
After the banks, Roosevelt decided to clean up Wall Street, as he had promised to do so in his New Deal.
So there's absolutely no doubt that there was a real New Deal. We had new regulations to stop the kinds of financial shenanigans that had caused the crisis.
To head the Securities and Exchange Commission, Roosevelt chose Joseph Kennedy, the father of the future president of the United States. Roosevelt had wanted to make him his secretary for the Treasury, but Congress had refused his nomination because Kennedy was about to be charged by a Senate Commission of Inquiry for stock market speculation, embezzlement, and above all, for his role in the collapse of Wall Street in 1929.
He becomes a major funder of his campaign, and Roosevelt shocks the nation by appointing Joseph Kennedy, of all people, to be the first chairman of the SEC.
Well, who better to watch the market? Joseph Kennedy actually made a large bit of his fortune not just in speculating in the 20s. He was one of the few who got out of the market because he saw what was coming. When the market crashed, he went back in and he started buying handfuls of stock of all kinds of companies and putting them in the drawers and waiting for them to come up again, because he knew eventually they'd be worth a lot.
He has connections to the bootleg liquor industry in the 1920s. He's a larger-than-life figure who becomes enormously wealthy and enormously despised by ordinary Americans as a not-to-be-trusted speculator who makes a fortune off of other people's misfortune.
But Roosevelt knew Kennedy was one of the brightest, shrewdest, unscrupulous, but after all, he's dealing with bankers and lawyers.
They were putting the fox in charge of the chicken coop. that was criticism. But the president had reasons for doing that, which is he said Mr. Kennedy knew all the tricks.
He knew Wall Street. He knew the games. He knew the backstories. He knew all of that. He knew where the bodies were buried.
Kennedy, as the first SEC chairman, was known himself for being somewhat of a swindler and a fraud. But to me, it's not inconsistent with what the SEC stands for. What the SEC stands for is an agency that permits and institutionalizes and exonerates fraud instead of fighting it. So the fact that Kennedy headed the SEC was actually quite a...
Roosevelt's naivety and lack of tact were sometimes surprising. To a group of young workers who had volunteered to finally have something to eat, he declared,
I wish that I could take a couple of months off from the White House and come down here and live with them, because I know I'd get full of health the way they have. The only difference is that they've put on an average of about 12 pounds apiece since they got here, and I'm trying to take off 12 pounds.
Roosevelt was good in reassuring people. He was good in convincing people that the government cared about them, the government could do something.
Preceded by a big show, Roosevelt launched his program to fight the effects of the Great Depression and to give a new boost to the American economy, which had been ravaged since the 1929 stock market crash. $5 billion were allocated to fight unemployment. Over 3 million Americans were hired, rising to 8 million 2 years later. Roosevelt had 15 key laws passed. He established a system of social welfare, pensions, unemployment benefit. He outlawed child labor, discrimination against hiring blacks and women, and he introduced a minimum wage.
What characterizes the New Deal in the mid-1930s is a whole array of public works programs.
Nobody had done this kind of thing before. People did have an idea, I think, that big public works projects would be a help, and that was an important part of the New Deal, and it was psychologically important.
The New Deal changed America. We built countless roads, bridges, dams, schools, roads and bridges here in New York City where we're sitting today that were built with New Deal money. It changed America dramatically. That wouldn't have occurred, and it set the stage for the post-World War II economic expansion.
Government spending had been used to build highways, construct schools, build hospitals, invest in research.
We move into a welfare state, which we had not had before. But they are really trying to deal with both manufacturing, with construction, with welfare, with social welfare, I should say, simultaneously.
There was no social welfare system. The United States was the last industrial country in the Western world to introduce any kind of social safety nets, like unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and so forth.
Il a fait des choses qui ont eu un avenir extraordinaire. Il a créé la sécurité sociale en 1935. Il a posé les bases de la sécurité sociale aux États-Unis.
Social Security did not apply to the poorest of workers, and these were the black workers. It did not apply to domestic workers, maids, dishwashers, porters. These were the jobs that were held by black people. They were the last in everything. They were the first to lose their jobs, if they had jobs. The black people simply did not benefit from the New Deal measures in the way that white people did.
African Americans were in the same position as other Americans, but worse, because they had been worse to begin with, and comes the Depression, the situation is extremely difficult.
The old unions had no black people. They only had skilled workers, and the black people were not the skilled workers. They were not allowed into the unions.
One of the reasons there is such a disparity in income and wealth in the 20s is because unions are so weak. There's no defense against this corporate effort to keep wages low.
Striking is still illegal in the United States, so until that time, a labor union had absolutely no standing in law.
All of that changes in the 1930s. A whole series of social uprisings in the 1930s move America's political spectrum to the left. and has an enormous impact on Roosevelt himself.
Supported by public opinion, Roosevelt set up the right to union representation for all American workers. It was an absolute revolution. But its implementation met with the reticence of the business world and company heads. Strikes and factory sit-ins occurred in many firms to protest about the bosses' refusal to recognize the unions. But the bosses finally gave in, as industry was at a standstill.
The labor movement explodes. It organizes millions of American industrial workers who had never been organized before in the heartland of American industry.
And that's what led to the wave of strikes. And it put Roosevelt in a very awkward position. And I don't think he regretted any of that, but it did make recovery that much more difficult.
There was a general strike in San Francisco, the whole city tied up. In Minneapolis, a general strike. Hundreds of thousands of workers in the South who worked in textile mills went out on strike. So this was a time in the country of great turmoil and agitation, and Roosevelt was very conscious of that.
The government of the New Deal supported the bosses, even when the latter had broken the new laws. Steel factories in Chicago refused to recognize the unions. Faced with the quasi-insurrectionary nature of strikes, the police, with the help of the bosses' militia, killed 10 workers and injured nearly 100. Roosevelt, who didn't condemn the massacre, sent in the National Guard.
The political leaders of the country in both parties, Republican and Democratic Party, were fearful when they saw the agitation in the country, and when they saw 1/3 of the workforce was unemployed, and when they saw all the strikes and the riots going on. The rich corporations were opposed to Roosevelt. They were worried about whether the capitalist system would be able to survive.
And the business community and the financial community begins to become very hostile. They denounce him in the most vile ways, as a cripple, as a Jew, as a communist, as gay. There's no epithet they won't direct at him. They're so angry at the way he has broken with the class, after all, that he came from. He's considered a traitor to his class. And Roosevelt says to them, bemused, I think, to some degree, why do you hate me so much? What I'm trying to do is save capitalism.
A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they will call it fascism, and sometimes communism, and sometimes regimentation, and sometimes socialism. But in so doing, they are trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very simple and very practical.
Those were good things that Roosevelt did. Those New Deals were good. Other parts of the New Deal were absurd.
The only sector which didn't improve was agriculture. To help the farmers survive, Roosevelt got them to reduce their production, to push up farming prices in exchange for compensation. But this policy was contested by several economists who considered that the government was carrying out an unjustifiable destruction of wealth which was contrary to the most elementary morality. The press began to criticize Roosevelt for his lack of ideology and for making contradictory decisions. Roosevelt is a chameleon on a Scotch plaid, the New York Times wrote.
And farmers were upset about the decline in agricultural prices. So they demanded government programs that would pay them to slaughter their cattle and to burn their crops in order to boost prices under FDR, which is crazy because people were starving at the same time. Why would you destroy perfectly good agricultural products? Because they actually thought the problem was too many agricultural products. That's scary, you know, because you're committing suicide there. There really was a spreading poverty and starvation in some areas.
California put guards at some of the borders trying to keep people out. They had state troopers trying to keep people from coming into California because these people would have been or were a burden on the state.
You could literally see the Depression etched in the faces. That's one of those wonderful photographs of people like Walker Evans and others. You can see the torment. It's like a cancer that ate at the spirit of the American people.
And one of the famous pictures of the Depression is of the migrant mother that was taken in a pea farm in California. She was a migrant worker coming from another part of the country with her children.
We grew up with that picture, which is a picture of a lady very hungry with her children, just devastated. You look at the picture a bit differently when you know that it was paid for by the government. And the man who ran the program that created this picture wrote in a memoir of it, we had to make the Depression look bad to keep our job. So you can have real poverty, but also real propaganda.
Ces photos de ces fermiers ruinés, il faut les regarder très attentivement. Ce sont des photos très construites, d'un dénuement extrêmement bien organisé. C'est la construction d'un tragique, mais qui ne livre pas du tout la totalité de ce qui s'est passé. Et ces fermiers ruinés, ils étaient ruinés souvent bien avant la crise. Et donc c'est pas la crise qui les a ruinés, c'était des catastrophes bien antérieures. Ces photos sont des fabrications de mythes. Et il faut les prendre comme telles. Il y a toute une famille, et puis il y a un lit avec des barreaux, et puis un petit enfant qui est tout nu par devant. Il y a un mélange de crasse et de dignité qui, je crois, évoque un mythe et qui n'est pas du tout de l'ordre du témoignage brut. C'est un témoignage extraordinairement élaboré pour construire ce mythe, mais qui ne répond pas du tout à l'ensemble des manifestations.
Enemies of the New Deal describe those photographs as propaganda on behalf of the New Deal. And they were. In some sense they were, because a new culture is being born then. It's a culture of popular solidarity, very foreign to America. And it is propaganda, but it's much more than propaganda. It's a new way of life that's born in the 1930s.
The New Deal helped many people. It put millions of people to work, gave jobs to 6 million people. It gave work to hundreds of thousands of young people.
Was it perfect? No. Were some of the programs bad? Yes, unquestionably. But that's never been in doubt.
The New Deal succeeded and failed at pulling the country out of the Great Depression. And the economy does actually recover. I don't mean recover back to the levels it didn't, but employment fall, factories start up again, people are, thanks to New Deal legislation, able to own their own homes again or to be able to meet their mortgage payments.
There was a sharp rise in the economy, a sharp expansion, and by 1937, the GDP, the total income of the country, was back to the 1929 level after a very sharp fall in the first 4 years. So there was a recovery. What happened in 1937 is fascinating. Roosevelt listened to a small group of economists and making the claim that you better cut back government spending.
So Roosevelt started cutting back on the New Deal, cutting back on the expenditures. And no wonder, as we contracted the expenditures, the economy started weakening.
What happened? Back into recession. And unemployment rate went up again.
And there was another depression within a depression in the 1936 to 1937 period. So it's simply not true to say that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. It deepened and prolonged it.
What ended the Depression is a depressing thing in itself, I suppose, but what ended the Depression was the rapid buildup of military spending because of the growing threat of war in Europe. Once you began to get a military buildup, suddenly you have more jobs than you have people. You go from massive unemployment and massive underutilization in the economy to full tilt overnight.
Tout d'un coup, du jour au lendemain, l'Amérique décide que les usines Ford, etc., vont fabriquer des tanks et des jeeps. Il n'y a plus une seule voiture qui sort. Donc l'effort de guerre, c'est un effort de production, mais du point de vue du taux de chômage, etc., oui, il n'y a pas de doute que ça a joué son rôle.
It was associated with an immense drive for armaments production on a massive scale, but also for all the things that soldiers need, for trucks and clothing, and this was what got America back to work again.
The economy was boosted by the war industries. So it was a kind of artificial way of keeping the economic system going.
None of Roosevelt's efforts managed to restore American industry to its level prior to Black Thursday. It was the war in Europe which kick-started U.S. industry. The Great Depression was over. 7 years of desperate efforts did less to cure the sick economy than a few months of rearmament.
Some people have made the wrong conclusion from that and said you need military expenditures to emerge from a downturn. That's nonsense. That's nonsense.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
Government spending on bombs was necessary to protect us against fascism.
In March 1938, the German army occupied Austria without firing a single shot. World War II had just begun.
And it's essentially only the Second World War that brings the United States back to full employment.
So that is certainly true. We did not return to what we consider full employment until 1940.
Does war take us out of the Depression? I would be loath to say that, but it certainly had some impact on it.
That pump priming on a massive scale, represented by World War II, produces a prolonged period of prosperity that lasts for another generation after the war.
And in 1944 and 45, the greatest fear of the American people was, when the war ends, will the Depression come back?
2 million bushels of North African grain, resold to Germany for Swiss francs, paid for by a consortium of banks with a deal in futures that the stock exchange unloads for coffee from Brazilian uplands, destined for Paris before the whole deal sinks. The checks, written in indelible inks, outrace Atlantics, winter hurricanes, our benefactors, 3 trusts they compete for, honor, glory, power, and of course, profits where all happiness is contained.
We learned something from the Great Depression. Whether we've learned them enough is another matter.
It's quite remarkable how ready we are to forget all those lessons when times change, and particularly when there's a profit to be made in forgetting that lesson.
We had the knowledge to prevent a depression then, but we didn't use it.
We didn't know how to do that after 1929, or there wasn't enough conviction for the government to act aggressively.
Et c'est le côté troublant de l'expérience Obama. Qu'est-ce que c'est Obama? C'est Roosevelt 2 ans plus tôt. Alors on pourrait dire c'est formidable. Voilà quelqu'un qui va relancer, faire beaucoup plus vite que Roosevelt ce que Roosevelt avait à peu près fait. Oui, mais qui il a pris dans son équipe? Il a pris des gens. Alors, il y a le côté novateur, c'est le côté écologique, le côté... Alors là, il a mis même carrément un prix Nobel comme ministre, et ça, c'est fabuleux. On voit très bien une ouverture très grande là. Et puis, du côté économique, Pour n'inquiéter personne, il a mis les responsables qui étaient pris la main dans le sac avant.
Et pour la même raison, il n'a pas eu le culot de nationaliser les banques américaines. Donc je pense qu'il y a quand même beaucoup à dire sur les plans de sauvetage qui finiront par produire leurs effets, parce qu'on sait qu'on reviendra sur l'ouvrage jusqu'à ce que ça marche. Mais on a perdu quand même beaucoup de temps. Cette crise, elle a commencé au cours de l'été 2007, on est en 2009, elle n'est toujours pas réglée.
And just like the savants of the 1920s, these folks turned out to be fatally wrong.
We're never going to have another crash. We're never going to have another depression. And they were both wrong, of course.
They had tools they could have implemented, and they did not. It was among the tragedies was this adoption of a damaging ideology as a cover for allowing the financial industry to do virtually anything they wanted, and for allowing, and mostly motivated by men and women who found a way to make a fortune and claim they were doing good for the nation.
The wealth of the richest 1% of the country has increased enormously, and the gap between rich and poor has become very, very great. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s.
We do need a new deal. The old New Deal was a New Deal that worked for the period of the time. It was a reaction to the Great Depression. The world changed enormously in 75 years. We are much wealthier now than we were then. But we have not shared the fruits of that wealth equally.
The level of greed simply rose. It was accepted. And greed became a very important part of the financial overreaction, the financial speculation that led to this disaster.
We allowed the banks to exploit the poorest Americans. Millions of Americans are losing their homes and with it their life savings. They were preyed on. There was predatory lending. We knew it was going on. It's an unfair system. Those who are poor have nobody to defend them. We live in a world with an enormous amount of resources, and yet a world in which 1 billion people live under $1 a day, and 40% of the world live probably under $2 a day. I continue to think that we will be able to reform, for instance, the international economic institutions. I realize the important role that a reformed international economic institutions can play. I'm not sure whether I'm a realist or an optimist when I say that I think that I know I'm a realist to say that they need to be reformed. I'm not sure I'm a realist when I say that they will be reformed.
2 million bushels of North African grain, resold to Germany for Swiss francs, paid for by a consortium of banks with a deal in futures that the stock exchange unloads for coffee from Brazilian uplands, destined for Paris before the whole deal sinks. The checks, written in indelible inks, outer race Atlantics, winter hurricanes. At last the coffee arrives, also the wheat. Needless to say, the deal was a success. Who can deny that all of us have gained? Our benefactors, three trusts they compete for: honor, glory, power, and of course, profits where all happiness is contained.